Well, good morning and welcome. Yesterday, the Social Security Board of Trustees, folks who provide us with results of Social Security's annual financial checkup, again sounded the alarm over the Social Security financial health. Unless Congress does its job, full benefits can't be paid on time, beginning Further, when today's 48-year-old workers reach their full retirement age in 2033, they and everyone else receiving retirement and survivor benefits will see a 23% cut. Today, 9 out of 10 seniors aged 65 and older receive Social Security benefits, which is a major source of income for most seniors. Since I've been chairman, I've been committed to making sure that Social Security will be there not just for today's seniors, but for their children and grandchildren. The price of delay gets higher every year, so the sooner we act, the better. As the public trustees informed us yesterday, the changes needed today are bigger than what Congress passed in 1983. It's no wonder young people don't believe they will ever receive benefits. A recent survey by Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies survey found 81% of those between the ages of 18 and 34 today don't believe Social Security will exist when it comes time for them to retire. As a result, these young people expect most of their retirement to be self-funded, resulting in 70% of them already saving for retirement. With the retirement of the baby boomers, the decline in traditional pensions, stagnant wages that make it even harder for Americans to save, and Social Security's impending inability to pay full benefits, Americans face a challenging retirement security landscape. Bottom line, Americans want, need, and deserve a Social Security program they can count on, but just as important, a program that they can understand. For instance, older workers getting ready to retire are trying to determine when they should retire and what benefits they should apply for. Yet deciding when to take Social Security benefits isn't just a question of how old you are. Workers have to answer questions like, how long am I going to live? Do I want to keep working? How much will my spouse receive from Social Security? As we will hear today, taking benefits at the wrong time can cost thousands of dollars. While Social Security has some tools to help, sometimes these tools aren't all that helpful. So what happens when well-meaning programs become so complex that Americans need paid help to figure out what their benefits are? Americans pay. In the disability program, many pay lawyers to help them receive disability benefits, while others are paying financial planners to help them figure out retirement benefits. Worse, those who can't afford to help pay with fewer or correct lower benefits than they deserve. And that's just wrong. There has to be a better way. Today's hearing isn't just about ensuring that Social Security will be there for current and future generations, but starting the much-needed conversation of what workers need to know about Social Security as they plan for their retirement. I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today and look forward to hearing your testimony. And I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Becerra, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, before I begin my opening statement, I want to again register my concern that we will be discussing the Social Security Trustees report, which was released yesterday, without hearing from the author of and the foremost expert on that report. That's the Social Security Chief Actuary, Stephen Goss. I would like to insert into the record this letter that I sent to you registering the Democrats' concern that Chief Actuary Goss was not invited to testify at our hearing to provide a neutral, nonpartisan explanation of the facts before we are presented with partisan policy recommendations. So I'd like to submit that into the record, Mr. Chairman.
You could have invited him, you know.
Mr. Chairman, we had one witness out of
and you
the
could
5
have
or 6.
invited him.
And we chose to invite someone as well. An official witness is usually invited.
Anybody object to having that put in the record? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For most Americans, Mr. Chairman, Social Security is the heart of retirement security. 6 out of 10 seniors rely on Social Security for more than half their income. For almost half of Americans over 80, nearly all of their income comes from Social Security. Without Social Security, nearly half of women over the age of 65 would be poor. Americans have earned that vital retirement security. Over 160 million Americans today pay into Social Security with their paychecks, tax contributions, every week in exchange for economic security for themselves and their families. Over its lifetime, Social Security has raised, through those tax contributions, $17.2 trillion and paid out $14.4 trillion, thereby accumulating a surplus of $2.8 trillion for future benefit payments. Now, only the highest income 25% of retirees receive any significant income from something other than Social Security, like an IRA or a work-based retirement plan. And that's even despite the substantial subsidies that are provided for retirement savings through the tax code. So, Mr. Chairman, the best way for Congress to improve retirement security for all Americans is by protecting Social Security from benefit cuts and making sure it is as strong for future generations as it was for their parents and grandparents. I am deeply concerned, for example, about the proposals several of our witnesses have put forth to cut Social Security's annual cost of living adjustment for current seniors. The so-called chain CPI would result in deep benefit cuts for those who need them the most. I also disagree with the proposals 4 of our witnesses have made in the past to privatize Social Security, cutting its guaranteed benefits. Mr. Chairman, I know I've said this before. In fact, I said it at our hearing on the Social Security Trustees report back on June of 2011. The biggest challenge facing Social Security right now is Republican budget cuts in the House of Representatives. At our hearing in 2011, I and other Democrats on the subcommittee asked you to hold hearings to find out how Americans were affected by a $622 million cut to the Social Security Administration's budget. We never had that hearing, even though prior to 2011, our committee had a bipartisan tradition of holding oversight hearings on SSA's budget and its ability to serve the American public. The cuts continued. Since the beginning of 2011, the number of Americans receiving Social Security has actually grown by almost 4 million people, but the Social Security Administration's budget is still lower today than it was 4 years ago in 2010. We now know some of the ways the cuts are affecting Americans who rely on Social Security. Social Security has lost 11,000 employees as a result of these cuts, almost 15% of its workforce. Some local Social Security offices are operating with staff shortages of more than 25%. Budget cuts force Social Security to reduce the number of hours their offices are open to the public by 1/5, including closing offices completely on Wednesday afternoons. Disabled workers today are waiting longer and longer to receive their earned benefits. 14% of Americans who try to call Social Security's 800 number get a busy signal, and those who get through are usually put on hold. Seniors who need help are waiting in long lines that stretch out the door of the Social Security office, sometimes in the hot or icy cold. Mr. Chairman, I again urge you to schedule a hearing on the Social Security Administration's budget so that we can examine these budget cuts and make sure Social Security can continue its long tradition of providing Americans with the services they paid for. Let me enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter that the Democrats on the subcommittee sent to you today reiterating our concern and requesting that we act now before the situation gets worse. The best thing that we can do, if we do really care about Social Security and we care about those Americans who have contributed every month through their paychecks a tax contribution to the Social Security system, is to make sure that we don't undermine the ability of the Social Security Administration to dispense the services these Americans have paid for. The money is there. We have challenges policy-wise to Social Security that are long-term. Today we face operating budget deficits in the billions, but Social Security has a surplus in the trillions. And so we have an opportunity to work together, bipartisan, to try to resolve these issues. But, Mr. Chairman, I urge you, and I submit this letter into the record, that, again, urges this subcommittee to do its oversight responsibility under the Constitution, to hold a hearing on the SSA's budget so we don't find ourselves falling into a situation where Social Security fails to provide the benefits that it always has on time and in full. With that, I request, Mr. Chairman, that this letter be submitted into the record. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Are there any objections? Hearing none, okay. You know, on the issue of Social Security Administration needing more money, I'd like to make 2 points. One, in the last decade, Social Security received a 34% increase in budget since GOP control. And all but one budget has been bipartisan, and all were signed by President Obama, your president. Just last week...
Our president, Mr. Chairman. Our president.
Just last week, we learned Social Security spent $300 million on failed implementation of a new computer system for the state disability determination services. That's $300 million that was wasted.
Mr. Chairman,
we need to watch out for that, too.
Parliamentary inquiry. I understand the Chairman, and Chairman has a prerogative to make additional remarks. We are working outside the regular order. I just want to make sure that if the Chairman's going to make some remarks, that we have an opportunity to do the same as well. And the Chairman's always been gracious in allowing that, so I just want to point that out.
Well, as is customary, any member is welcome to submit a statement for the hearing record. And as we move to testimony today, I want to remind our witnesses to please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. However, without objection, all the written testimony will be made a part of the hearing record. We have a one witness panel today, and seated at the table are Charles Blayhouse. He's a public trustee, Social Security and Medicare Board of Trustees. Welcome aboard. Sylvester Schieber, PhD, independent consultant. C. Eugene Sterling, PhD, Institute Fellow, and Richard B. Fisher, Chair, Urban Institute. Joan Entmeyer, is that correct? Yes. Vice President, Family Economic Security, National Women's Law Center. Andrew Biggs, Resident Scholar, American Enterprise Institute. And Lawrence Kotlikoff, is that correct? PhD, William Fairfield Warren Professor, Boston University, Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Dr. Blayhouse, please go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, all the members of the subcommittee. It's a great honor to appear before you today again to discuss the recently released projections of the trustees and the implications for workers' retirement planning. The light says it's on, but... Okay. With your permission, my written testimony has a longer analysis, but I'd like to use my oral remarks to simply make 4 quick points. First point is simply that Social Security faces a substantial financing shortfall, and as of yesterday, we reconfirmed that part of that shortfall has become an immediate problem. In our latest projections released yesterday, we project the Disability Insurance Trust Fund will be depleted in the 4th quarter of 2016. What's important to remember about that is that this is not an indication that we only have a problem on the disability side. In fact, what we found was that the long-term shortfall in the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is actually larger than it is on the disability side. The reason it's showing up first on the disability side is primarily, not solely, but primarily because the baby boomers move through their ages of peak disability incidence before they hit retirement age. So rather than interpreting this as a problem that is solely confined to DI, I would urge the interpretation. It's basically the first manifestation, the sort of the first element of financial crisis associated with problems that are afflicting the program as a whole. Second point I would make is that uncertainty as to how this shortfall is going to be resolved is a threat to workers' retirement security for a number of reasons. One is that as long as workers don't know how we're going to resolve it, the means of resolution is unknown. Workers can't make their plans. They don't know what's going to be required in terms of additional tax contributions. They don't know what their benefits are going to be. And also, the longer we delay, the larger the relative sacrifice that we require from each birth cohort, because we have fewer birth cohorts that can contribute to the solution. Another very important factor in my judgment is that the closer we come to, say, 2033, the greater the uncertainty becomes that we're going to be able to repair the shortfall at all within the historical financing structure of Social Security. Just for purposes of illustration, consider that if we wanted to do a solution today, we wanted not to raise taxes and we wanted not to cut benefits for people now in retirement, we'd have to reduce the benefits of people newly coming onto the rolls by 21%. But if we wanted to employ that same strategy in 2033, even cutting off the entirety of their benefits would not solve the problem. So clearly by 2033, our opportunity is long past. And there's a point between now and then that our opportunity to close the shortfall within the historical financing structure disappears. And that's a problem, because if we can't maintain Social Security finances under the historical financing structure, then we'd have to find a different means of doing it. And programs financed, for example, from the general fund, they tend to be more changeable than Social Security. They tend to be more subject to sudden eligibility changes, benefit changes, means tests, that sort of thing, things that Social Security has generally escaped in the past. Third point I'd make is that our costs of Social Security are rising faster than our economic output. That wouldn't be a problem if it reflected a greater national capacity to finance these benefits. But because Social Security is not a savings program, it's an income transfer program. So basically, any benefit gains that come to one group have to come at the cost of a different group, at least from a financial perspective. And so what's happening is we're increasing our commitments to paying higher benefits without increasing our national capacity to finance them, and that's an issue. The final point I would make, Mr. Chairman, is that this may seem paradoxical, but there are certain ways in which we could actually enhance retirement security by slowing the growth of costs. You have to remember that retirement security is not only a function of annual income and assets, but it's also a function of the number of years over which you have to stretch your retirement resources. And there's a lot of evidence that the current design of Social Security is causing people to withdraw prematurely from the workforce and run greater risk of outliving their savings. And if we could possibly repair some of these inducements and incentives in the course of slowing the growth of costs, we could simultaneously put the program on a sounder financial footing and increase retirement security at the same time. We also have a problem in the sense that the rising costs of financing the current benefit formula is depressing the relationship between workers' pre-retirement earnings and their post-retirement benefits, and that's an issue as well. What's happening, and that's particularly an issue for low-income people, because you have many people who are in the situation now where they actually expect better standards of living in retirement than they have as workers. And this has terrible implications for their ability to put aside saving, their labor force attachment, and other problems. And we see the results of that in the paucity of savings that a lot of groups have outside of Social Security. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I've been misspeaking a lot lately. Yes, the financing shortfall facing Social Security, it creates substantial income risks for Americans who are planning for retirement. We can minimize this risk by enacting financing reforms that preserve Social Security's historical financing structure while reducing cost growth to rates that can be financed within a stable tax rate. Retirement income security would also be enhanced by reforms that increase labor force attachment and remove disincentives to saving. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Schieber, welcome. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Becerra, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. In the opening section of my submitted testimony, I discussed the major approaches to assessing how workers are doing in their retirement preparations. Life cycle and similar models are good tools to facilitate policymakers and analysts' understanding of how the retirement system is working, but are beyond the grasp or the interest of most workers. Plan sponsors and administrators who are at the nexus of workers' retirement savings more generally depend on earnings replacement rate models for plan design and communications for broad participant population, because broad rule of thumb direction is often the best that can be offered to large group of workers participating in these plans. Indeed, the Social Security Administration introduces its own retirement planner on its official website discussing retirement planning in terms of target earnings replacement rates. In the early 20th century, plan sponsors focused on retirees having income that would allow them to maintain their career standard of living. Over the last 40 years or so, replacement rates have been used explicitly in plan design and communication by plan sponsors. Conventional replacement rate targets have been estimated to allow workers to have spendable income in retirement that is equivalent to that achieved toward the end of the career. For most plan designers and retirement counselors, the pre-retirement earnings measure used in defining the replacement rate targets is the salary level at retirement or average earnings over the last 5 years of the career. For researchers, price-indexed career average earnings or price-indexed earnings a few years prior to retirement are often used because earning patterns toward the end of the career tend to decline. So using the final years gives you a misimpression of what's going on. Social Security earnings replacement rates presented by the trustees are not equivalent to the conventional replacement rate measures. I understand they've been taken out of this year's trustees report, but they've been in prior reports, and there was an actuarial note released yesterday regarding these. They are based on career average wage indexed earnings for which most workers, especially lower earners, are significantly higher than their career average real earnings. The Social Security actuaries did publish a note on this yesterday. But let's consider the hypothetical medium worker retiring at age 65. Using their assumptions from last year's trustees report, this worker earned $22,295 in 1990, the equivalent of $39,811 in today's dollars because of CPI indexing. But they counted the earnings as $47,740 in calculating this worker's replacement rate. Now, when workers go to the grocery store, the auto repair shop, or wherever, they don't spend wage index dollars. They spend the real dollars they have in their pocket. And so it's not clear why we want to treat these standards of living they never achieved during their working career as the standard of living against which we're judging benefits. In Table 1 of my submitted remarks, you can see the conventional measures of Social Security replacement earnings result in replacement rates that are higher than those presented by the trustees for full career workers retiring at normal retirement age. I understand that benefits are developed using career average wage indexed earnings, but have found that even economists who have studied Social Security for years often do not understand that the trustees' replacement rates are calculated using a different base year than the index used to determine their benefits. Some analysts even apply wage indexing to all pre-retirement income in refining retirement income targets, suggesting that workers should be saving beyond what is needed to maintain their pre-retirement standard of living. Our retirement system should not expect workers to become slaves to financing retirement living standards they never achieved while working. My analysis of the 31 and 38 birth cohorts of Social Security beneficiaries, summarized in Table 2, suggests this problem may be accentuated over time as average wage indexed earnings rise more rapidly than real wages for workers. Replacement of real earnings is increasing under this system. One reason for the widely perceived inadequacy of workers' savings for retirement outside of Social Security today is a series of reports published by the Social Security Administration summarizing survey data gathered by the Census Bureau in this current population survey. We heard a summary of this in the opening remarks this morning. Comparison of the reported income provided by pension annuity plans and IRAs to Social Security from IRS tax filings, shown in Table 3 of my submitted remarks, proves that as much as 60% of the pension and IRA income paid to Social Security beneficiaries is not being captured by the current population survey. This is a problem the Census Bureau and Social Security has known about for 20 years. If the full income being paid to Social Security beneficiaries by supplemental retirement plans was being reported, it would be roughly equivalent to Social Security benefits instead of less of half of that amount, and it would be above Social Security benefits for the top half of the distribution, income distribution of retirees. These benefits distribute much more broadly down the income distribution than Social Security's reporting indicates. It is impossible to clearly understand who is doing well, who is doing poorly under the current arrangements if official government reports on the income status of retirees ignores hundreds of billions of dollars of their income. I have a formal analysis of this issue that was published in the Journal of Retirement earlier this year. I would be happy to submit to the committee if you're so interested.
Please do. Thank you. Dr. Sterling, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Becerra. It's an honor to be here with you again, and also to the members of the subcommittee. Contrary to the popular argument that we live in an age of austerity, I'd like to suggest that we live in an age of extraordinary opportunity. Yet, as I argue in a book, Dead Men Ruling, that actually I sent to each member of this subcommittee, we block Congress by constantly refighting yesterday's battles. As only one reflection, in 2009, every dollar of revenue had been committed before that new Congress walked through the Capitol doors. Looking to Social Security, after 3/4 of a century of continual growth, it has largely succeeded in providing basic protections to most, though not all, older people. Now, as psychologist Laura Carstensen suggests, we should be redesigning our institutions around the new possibilities that improved health care and long lives provide. But the eternal automatic growth of Social Security is not conditioned on any assessment of society's opportunities or needs, not making the best use of the talents of people of all ages, not child or elderly poverty, not educational failures or the incidence of Alzheimer's or autism. Let me focus on 3 problems caused by this past rather than future focus. And I should point out that these are problems that apply regardless of whether one's a progressive or conservative, because neither progressive nor conservative principles would allow these types of problems to exist. The first is the ways that Social Security provides unequal justice to many. The second is the consequence of providing ever larger shares of Social Security resources to the middle-aged. And the last is how each year that reform is delayed adds to the burden passed on to younger generations. First, to unequal justice. Social Security redistributes in many ways both progressive and regressive, and many fail to provide equal justice. Among the most outrageous, working single parents, often abandoned mothers, are forced to pay for spousal and survivor benefits they cannot receive, often receiving at least $100,000 fewer lifetime benefits than some who don't work, don't pay Social Security tax, and raise no children. Similarly, the system discriminates against two-earner couples, against spouses who divorce before 10 years of marriage, against long-term workers, and those who beget or bear children before age 40. To the second point, middle-age retirement. People today retire about a decade longer than they did when Social Security first started paying benefits. Let me be clear, the biggest winners of this multi-decade policy have been people like the witnesses at this table and the members of Congress who, if married, now get about $300,000 in additional lifetime benefits. This is not a way to redistribute to people in need or people with shorter life expectancies. But there are other consequences: a decline in the employment rate as reflected in Congressional Budget Office reports, a decline in the rate of growth of GDP and of personal income, as well as lower Social Security benefits for the truly owed, since they received so much earlier in their lives. Meanwhile, within a couple decades, close to 1/3 of the adult population will be on Social Security for 1/3 or more of their adult lives. There is no financial system, public or private, that can provide so many years of retirement for such a large share of the population without severe repercussions, both for individuals' well-being in retirement and for the workers upon whose backs the system relies. Finally, the impact on the young. Today's lifetime Social Security and Medicare benefits approximate about $1 million for a couple with average incomes throughout their working lives. That large number comes about largely because of the number of years of support. Rising by about $18,000 a year, benefits for a couple in 2030 are scheduled to grow to about $1.25 million. Meanwhile, the rate of return on contributions falls continually for each generation. Each year of delayed reform shifts more burdens to younger generations from older ones, with the largest impact on groups like blacks and Hispanics, in part because they comprise a larger share of those future generations who are scheduled to get lower returns than current generations retiring. In summary, each year of delay in reforming Social Security continues a pattern of unequal justice under the law, threatens the well-being of the truly owed, increases the share of benefits going to the middle-aged, leads government to spend ever less on education and other investments, contributes to higher non-employment, lower personal income and revenues, not in Social Security, but throughout the system, and increases the burden that is shifted to the young and to people of color. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Entmacher, welcome. Please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Becerra, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify today on behalf of the National Women's Law Center. For a large majority of Americans, Social Security is not only their major source of retirement income, but the most secure and predictable. Benefits are modest, but incredibly important. The average Social Security benefit for women 65 and older is about $13,000 a year. It's about $17,000 for older men. As Mr. Becerra said, without Social Security, half of women 65 and older would be poor. And for 2/3 of seniors, Social Security provides at least half of their retirement income. It's virtually the only source of income for over 1/3 of seniors. These data are from the current population survey. While Mr. Schreiber has criticized this survey for not fully reflecting income distributions from retirement accounts, other surveys confirm that most seniors can't expect much support from their retirement savings. The Federal Reserve Board's survey of consumer finance shows that half of households between ages 65 and 74 had no assets in retirement accounts. 2/3 of those over 75 had no retirement assets. Younger generations aren't doing much better. 45% of all working-age families and 40% of families near retirement have nothing in retirement accounts. These data show that today's workers will also be heavily reliant on Social Security. They can't afford benefit cuts, whether as part of privatization plans that would replace secure benefits with risky private accounts, a lower and less accurate cost of living adjustment, or further increases in the retirement age. We do need to increase retirement savings for average Americans, and the surest and most effective way to do it is to protect and enhance Social Security. Social Security is already virtually universal and provides lifelong benefits that are adjusted for inflation. In addition, it provides life and disability insurance for workers and their families, imposes few responsibilities on employers, and is highly efficient. There are several reforms that would improve the adequacy and equity of Social Security, as Mr. Sterling has testified, and which I mentioned in my written testimony. What I want to emphasize is that they are affordable. The Social Security report of the trustees shows that there is a long-term shortfall, but Social Security is fundamentally sound. On a combined basis, it can pay promised benefits in full until 2033 and 77% of benefits after that. It would be irresponsible for Congress to wait until the trust funds are within 6 months of exhaustion, as it did in 1983, before taking action to strengthen Social Security. But 2 decades provides time for Congress to enact reforms that raise revenue and improve benefits. Polls show that a large majority of Americans favor this approach. However, there are 2 issues that require immediate attention. Congress should prevent cuts to disability benefits in 2016 and reassure all workers that if they are seriously injured and can no longer work, that Social Security will be there for them. It can do this by the simple and routine step of reallocating payroll taxes to rebalance Social Security's 2 trust funds. Congress has done this 11 times in the past and in both directions. Second, Congress needs to restore adequate funding to the Social Security Administration. Cuts in services are already jeopardizing timely access to the benefits Americans have earned and fall especially hard on the most vulnerable people. Moreover, at least in part for budgetary reasons, Social Security plans to rely even more on conducting its work through online interactions. But this strategy has its limits, even for those who are internet savvy. The Social Security website touts how quick and easy it is to sign up for benefits online. But deciding when to take benefits is a major financial decision, and applicants should be able to consult with well-trained staff to get help understanding their options and their consequences. In addition, access to and ability to use online services is more limited among the population of elderly people and people with disabilities that Social Security serves. And even people who have no problem applying for benefits online at 66 may not be able, at age 90, to go online to correct an erroneous deduction for Medicare premiums. In announcing this hearing, Chairman Johnson, you said, Americans want, need, and deserve a Social Security program they can count on and understand. I could not agree more, and I thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Biggs, welcome. Please
Thank you.
proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Becerra, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this morning. Much of what Americans need to know about Social Security and retirement is difficult to understand. Worse, much of what we think we know turns out not to be true. I would start by saying that we should not panic and we should not pass far-reaching policy changes in haste. For instance, some have proposed substantial expansions of the Social Security program, with others arguing that these expansions should be financed by reducing tax advantages for private retirement saving plans, such as IRAs and 401ks. This would be a mistake. The state of retirement security in the U.S. is substantially better than you probably think. While some studies claim that Americans face a so-called retirement crisis, these articles make a number of methodological choices that, in my view, are unsupportable. They overestimate what Americans need for retirement, understate what Americans have saved, and misunderstand how family structures and health costs affect the amount that one must save for retirement. Other high-quality research, including projections from the Social Security Administration itself, show a much more positive view of Americans' retirement saving. For instance, the Social Security Administration's Office of Retirement and Disability Policy maintains what is surely the most comprehensive model of retirement income in the country. This model simulates on a person-by-person, year-by-year basis employment, pension offerings and participation, individual investment decisions, and of course the accrual of Social Security benefits. The SSA model estimates that Americans who were born in the Depression had a total retirement income at age 67 equal to 109% of their career average earnings indexed for inflation. We can't judge for ourselves whether that amount is enough. What is significant in this context, though, is SSA does not forecast a large decline in retirement going forward. For instance, fast forward to the Generation Xers, who are widely assumed to be dramatically undersaving for retirement. The SSA model projects that the median Gen Xer will at age 67 have a retirement income equal to 110% of his career average earnings adjusted for inflation. Retirement income will come from different sources, from defined contribution plans rather than defined benefit plans, but the SSA model, which I believe is the best in the business, does not produce numbers that scream out retirement crisis. But there is much more that we can do to provide individuals with better information about the retirement savings decisions they make. As my testimony details, the benefit estimates provided in the annual Social Security statement are expressed in a form, so-called wage index dollars, which are essentially meaningless from a retirement planning point of view, and which almost no users of the statement could possibly understand. The figures published by the SSA, which include both the benefit estimates published in the statement and replacement rate calculations, which Dr. Schieber discusses in his testimony, are potentially very useful in retirement planning, but are currently calculated in a way that is simply incorrect. For instance, for a 30-year-old worker today, the benefit estimate he will receive on his Social Security statement understates the true inflation-indexed value of that future benefit by around 35%. The agency needs to get these figures right. But the biggest problem with retirement security today isn't America's savers. It's America's legislators who literally for decades have ignored the need to fix Social Security's finances. According to Social Security's trustees, the program's 75-year deficit has risen by 66% since 2008. The Congressional Budget Office's figures are even worse. According to the CBO, Social Security's long-term deficit has nearly quadrupled in the past 6 years. While the CBO once projected that Social Security would be solvent until mid-century, today both CBO and SSA project insolvency in the early 2030s. In other words, the insolvency date for Social Security, according to CBO at least, has moved forward by nearly 2 decades just in the past 6 years. How much worse does this problem have to get before both political parties step up to the plate and fix Social Security? Saving for retirement is our job as individuals. Fixing retirement programs is your job as members of Congress, and I respectfully suggest that we all get down to business. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your comments. Dr. Kotlikoff, you are now recognized.
It's a great honor, Chairman Johnson and Mr. Becerra and other distinguished members of the committee to be with you. I guess I'm on the left side of this table because I'm facing the Republicans. Maybe I might be viewed as a Republican because I was probably invited by the Republican members.
You're on our right.
You know, okay. Well, let me just say I've been voting on the left for my entire adult career. I voted for every Democratic president, including our current president. So I just want the people on the Democratic members to realize that I'm speaking here today, and also the Republican members, not as a political person. I'm an academic, I'm an economist, and I'm here to tell you some things that you haven't heard so far, and you may not hear from anybody else about Social Security solvency and about its complexity and inequities, although some of these Gene mentioned. I think the first thing I want you to realize is that we have issues of generational inequity or fairness, and we also have issues of intragenerational inequity and fairness. And I think these things keep getting kind of confused. The Democrats, I sense, are very concerned about fairness within a generation. Are the rich being treated, who are the same given age, being treated fairly relative to the poor? And that's an important issue. But I want you to set aside that and assume that everybody within a cohort is exactly the same. So, Mr. Becerra, everybody your age, suppose everybody your age was exactly the same and looked just like you, okay? And everybody who's a year younger was the same and looked just like that person. And we have old people and young people, and there's no differences within the cohort. So would we want to leave enormous bills for our children and future generations? Would we want to engage in policies that social insurance policies, other kinds of policies that may do enormous good and may be very important because insurance markets don't operate very well? There's good economic arguments, but then the question is getting the government involved to fix some of these problems is one thing. Another thing is leaving future generations to pay for those fixes, pay the bills of future generations. And we have really a generational crisis here of enormous proportions. And the way economists look at this is we look at the fiscal gap. We look at, over the entire future of the economy, how much are the projected expenditures compared to the projected taxes measured in present value? What's the gap? What's the fiscal gap? This is what economists measure. The fiscal gap in the U.S. is currently $210 trillion. The country, that's according to the CBO's alternative fiscal scenario data released last week. That's 58% of the present value of revenue. So this country is 58% underfinanced. Detroit is about 20% underfinanced. Social Security by itself is 33% underfinanced. If you look at table F61 in the trustees report released yesterday, you'll see that there's a $24.9 trillion unfunded liability over the infinite horizon. It's not over 75 years. Nothing in economics tells us to look at 75 years and ignore the future. I have children. I'm sure many of you do as well. I started a little bit late, so I have young children who will be alive in 75 years. We can't ignore the commitments to them, and there's nothing in economics that allows us to do that in economic theory. So we have to measure things correctly, and economic theory is very clear that we should be measuring the infinite horizon fiscal gap. The trustees report is burying that number. They've been calculating it since 2002. The trustees don't even mention it in their summary statement. We hear statements that we just heard a statement that says Social Security is fundamentally sound. A system that is in worse shape than Detroit's pension systems is not fundamentally sound. A system that's 58% underfinanced, according to the trustees' report, is not fundamentally, sorry, that's the entire country. The Social Security system is 33% underfinanced. This stuff is not fundamentally sound. We have to start thinking about things from a generational perspective, and that does not mean that you should not also focus on intragenerational equity. I'm all for that, okay? I've been a lifelong Democrat in terms of voting. I'm with you. And we have to look at that too. We have to look at fairness within and across generations, but we can't keep confusing these things. We can't, in the name of intragenerational equity, ignore what we're doing to all the children, poor and rich and alike. So now let me just mention, the last 6 seconds, what I'm going to do is show you Social Security's formula for the benefits of a spouse, age 8, 10 functions, 10 mathematical functions. This is the first time anybody's ever actually expressed this in math. 10 functions, one's in 4 dimensions, one's a maximum function. There's also side conditions that are very complicated, many functions to determine those side conditions of the variables that go in here. One of those side conditions is a maximum of a min function. It could not be more complex. People are making all kinds of crazy mistakes, and Social Security people, the people in the offices are providing all kinds of bad advice because the thing is just crazily complex. We need a new system that is not going to go broke.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
As is customary for each round of questions, I will limit my time to 5 minutes and ask my colleagues to also limit their questioning time to 5 minutes as well. Dr. Blehaus, according to this year's report, if Congress doesn't act come 2033, everybody receiving benefits will face a 23% cut. Worse, in just 2 years, everybody receiving disability insurance will face a 19% cut in benefits. Now, some of my friends on the other side like to say that 2033 is way off in the future and that Congress has plenty of time. Social Security is well and good right now. First, based on the trustees' report, would it be right to say that Social Security is in crisis right now?
Well, we certainly, I would say we certainly face a crisis on the disability side. And I would certainly say that we face a shortfall that is bigger than we've ever successfully corrected before. And so, yes, I think it's a very pressing and urgent policy concern.
Well, is it fair to say then that we're already facing the largest shortfall Social Security's ever faced? And can you explain that in simple terms? How big is the Social Security shortfall right now?
I've discovered in my public life that I'm terrible at this making complex issues as simple as that. But I would say I think Dr. Kotlikoff did it pretty well. Where you can think of it in terms of the fraction of current benefit obligations that are unfinanced. We're looking, when you go out to 2033, you're talking a quarter of the benefits that we're promising are not financed. Or you can look at another way, say that people's tax revenues that they're paying are short by a third of what they need to be to fund promised benefits. So, if you look at your tax return, the amount of payroll taxes you're paying, and imagine yourself paying an additional third on top of that, you get a sense of how big the problem is.
Yeah, I hear you. And some of my Democrat friends like to say there's plenty of money in Social Security, so we have nothing to worry about. You want to address that?
I would say that the date of trust fund depletion and the amount of money in the current trust fund does not provide very useful information about how much time we have. Because if you wait to the point where it's drawn down and run out, it's too late to fix it because
Correct.
The gap is too big. So I would urge that you think in terms of how much longer is the problem still at a soluble level. And when you think about it that way, you realize that the time is much shorter than the large trust fund balance might suggest.
Well, what price will beneficiaries in today's workers pay if it's not fixed before maybe this president leaves office?
Well, I think, let me give you a two-part answer if I could. There's a part that I think most experts would give, and then there's a part that I would give that most experts wouldn't. But I think most experts would say they're going to pay a very high financial price for delay, that young Americans entering the system are going to lose about 4% of their lifetime wage income through the program as a net income loss, even net of all the benefits they get. But I would say there's another risk that they face, and I think a lot of the policy community has been slow to recognize this, which is that they run the risk of having a Social Security system that isn't structured the way it has been in the past. Historically, for better or worse, there has been pretty good bipartisan acceptance of the way we finance Social Security. And so benefits have been relatively safe from sudden changes because of the way we pay for Social Security out of the payroll tax. But if we go to a system that we can't balance that way and we have to subsidize it permanently from the general fund, then all those bets are off. Then suddenly people are subjected to much greater income insecurity because of the fact that programs financed from the general fund tend to be much more subject to sudden benefit changes and means tests and things of that nature than Social Security has been.
Well, I'm not sure we can increase taxes enough to cover it. Dr. Schieber and Dr. Biggs, is there anything you want to add to those statements?
Well, if you think about, 4% of a worker's earnings is kind of an abstract concept, unless you're a worker facing 4% additional taxes on your earned income each year. If you think about it over a 40, 45-year career, somebody starts working in their early 20s, they work till 65, 6, 7, 45 years, we're talking about taking 2 more years of their earnings to pay for a benefit that's essentially the equivalent of the benefit we're paying to people of my generation right now. And that seems to be a very substantial levy against them, knowing how hard it is for young people today to get a start in life. There's no reason to expect that the kids matriculating through high school and even the ones through grade school are necessarily going to have that much easier time to start. So, there is a limit. I think there's an equity issue here that we need to think about if we're going to talk about delay.
Thank you. My time's expired. Mr. Becerra, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony today. Let's see, where should we go? It's interesting. Mr. Chairman, let me clarify something for you. Democrats do not think that we should be hunky-dory, going around town, just thinking that we should do nothing on Social Security. I think Democrats have said for a long time, we should keep the most successful program that has ever been devised in America to help Americans have security, economic security, stay strong, moving into the future. And so we're prepared to meet the challenge that faces Social Security. And there is a challenge. We've heard it discussed here. In about 20 years, we're going to be hitting a challenge. I wouldn't call it a crisis. I'd call a crisis what happened to all of Enron's employees who put money into their pensions and found out when they woke up one day that Enron no longer had any of their money that they were counting on for retirement. That's a crisis. I call a crisis that we go to war in Iraq, never pay a dime of it with real money using the government credit card, spend over $1 trillion, still haven't paid for it. And if you want to talk about infinite horizons, this so-called projection into the future of forever, I don't know how you do that, but apparently some folks think you can project infinitely into the horizon. What's the cost of never having paid for $1 trillion war? And what will that cost be in year of infinity? The issue is this. It's how do you make sure you give Americans that security? Ms. Entmacher made a really good point. The average benefit is about $1,200 a month under Social Security. No one's going to get rich off of that. And I know we use euphemisms. Mr. Blauhaus, you use the euphemism of slowing the growth of cost. That's another way of saying cutting benefits. And so, yeah, you can slow the growth of cost in Social Security, which means cutting a Social Security recipient's $1,200 benefit. You want to talk about a crisis, talk about someone who depends almost exclusively on Social Security, about cutting their benefits. And that's a crisis, especially for women in America who, as Ms. Entmacher pointed out, earn less than men do when they retire because they've done the business of helping raise the next generation, and they get penalized for not being able to stay in the workforce as long as a man does. Those are the crises that we have to address. But Social Security, with $2.8 trillion right now in reserves, is that a crisis today? No, I call a federal budget operating deficit in the billions, hundreds of billions, as something we have to tackle today. I think we have time to deal with Social Security on a bipartisan basis, but we should not try to panic Americans, especially young Americans, who today don't know where they're going to have their retirement savings, because now these defined contribution plans could be like Enron, where poof, it's gone if that company doesn't make good investment decisions. And so I think we should be careful about how we discuss Social Security, because I don't think anyone can name me a private sector program that works as a retirement benefit, disability insurance, and a life insurance policy all at the same time, and over 78 years never having once failed to pay on time and in full. So I can name a lot of Enrons in the private sector. We can talk about the situation, the crisis in the Veterans Administration. Social Security is not one of those. But the important thing is we should not let Social Security become one of those failures by underfunding it with its budget. It is growing in the number of people that it has to serve, yet its budget is smaller today than it was 4 years ago. And Mr. Chairman, whether our Republican majority in the House of Representatives wishes to hold a hearing, as we should because of our oversight responsibilities under the Constitution, to determine how Social Security Administration is doing, this will come back to haunt anyone who wishes to hide under the rocks about this budget for Social Security. Ms. Mocker, women have a tougher time in retirement because they live longer than men, and they've earned less in retirement, whether it's through a private pension plan or through Social Security. What would happen to that population of women who are going to continue to outlive men if we were to cut benefits by, say, doing the chain CPI, and also continue to see the budget for the Social Security Administration be well under what it needs to be able to provide sufficient services to those Americans?
Well, the chain...
The gentleman's time has expired, so please be brief.
I will. The chain CPI is a way of computing the annual cost of living adjustment that's lower and I would say less accurate than the current way it is computed. That cut adds up every single year you live. It's kind of like compound interest in reverse. And we calculated that for a single elderly woman receiving the median benefit, by age 80, her benefit would be cut by $54 a month, which may not sound like a lot, but it's the equivalent of 1 week's worth of food every single month that she can no longer afford. So that is a severe cut in benefits. Of course, the service cuts mean that it may be more difficult to access the Social Security benefits that you've earned if there is a problem, that you're receiving accurate benefits. If you need to change your bank account, it's just that much harder to get hold of someone to get it straightened out and to make sure that you continue to get your benefits that you count on time and in full.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. T-Berry, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I had a former governor in Ohio, a friend of mine, also U.S. Senator George Voinovich, when he became governor, said, we need to do more with less. That doesn't mean we need to do less with less. We need to do more with less, and he succeeded in doing that. Let me share with you, because the budget's been talked about, these are numbers from the Social Security Administration. This makes a lot of sense. A higher number than ever customers, Social Security recipients, use the Social Security online tools more than ever, which there's obviously a cost savings, 50.9% in fiscal year 2013. I'll tell you another great statistic is, these are surveys. This is an annual survey, fiscal year 2013, from, again, Social Security customers. 80.2% said that the Social Security office that they worked with provided services of excellent, very good, or good in 2013, 80.2%. And I know that's true in the office near my hometown of Worthington, Ohio, just outside Columbus. So I think those are good things to remember as we talk about the Social Security budget. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record 2 articles from the Columbus Dispatch. The first, titled Democrats' Plan Won't Save Social Security, Congress's Budgeters Say, written on Thursday, July 17th by Jack Torrey. In that article, it says that a Senate plan that is designed to both preserve Social Security and expand its benefits for some by raising payroll taxes on the wealthy. The report by the Congressional Budget Office concludes that to make the Social Security solvent for the next 75 years, payroll taxes would have to be raised on all working Americans who pay Social Security taxes. And in response to that, Mr. Chairman, a Tuesday, July 22nd editorial in the same newspaper, Stop Ignoring Good Advice, CBO report renews calls for leaders to fix financial fundamentals. And in the text of the editorial, it says, promising people more benefits at no cost isn't new, especially in an election year, but a Democrat-backed plan that purports to expand Social Security payments at no additional cost to most Americans simply isn't realistic, a fact backed by the Congressional Budget Office report last week that also provided a sobering reminder for the need to get serious about entitlement reform overall. Senate Democrats recently backed a plan that they said would preserve Social Security, expand benefits for many. They said the increase would be paid for by payroll taxes on those making more than $117,000 per year. The current threshold above the Social Security taxes aren't levied. Unfortunately, CBO found the math doesn't add up. The nonpartisan research arm of Congress said to simply keep Social Security solvent for the next 75 years, payroll taxes would need to be raised on all working Americans. And it goes on. So I'd like to submit both of those for the record.
Without objection.
So which brings me to a point I'm going to make. And maybe Dr. Biggs, you can help me, because in your testimony, you kind of touched on this. Some say, well, the crisis isn't here. I have a 47-year-old sister. She's a woman. It's my sister. She retires. Her full retirement is in 20 years. Coincidentally, that's the same year that the report that you all provided, the CBO provided, said that the jig is up if we don't do anything. Now, my sister doesn't have a whole lot of confidence, my 47-year-old sister, as she's planning for retirement today with 2 kids, that she's going to be taken care of. My even younger sister, who's 40, has less enthusiasm, to your point, about fixing the current system for what she's thinking about in terms of retirement, let alone my 4 daughters, 5 through 11, and what this report means to them. And so the Senate Democrat plan, I don't know if you've seen it, which the article and the editorial take issue with. If we're to expand benefits, raising payroll taxes on wealthier Americans to do it, wouldn't we be right back where we are today, kicking the can down the road and impacting my 4 daughters, since we're concerned about the wages of women?
Thank you for your question. In a sense, you actually wouldn't be right back where you were. You'd be worse off. And the reason is this. I mean, I'm not in favor of fixing Social Security by raising or eliminating the so-called tax max on payroll taxes. I think that cap was put in place by Franklin Roosevelt for a reason, so that the system doesn't look like a welfare plan. So it's something which everybody pays and everybody receives out in reasonable measure. That it's not just a take from the rich, give to the poor kind of thing. And I think Roosevelt, I mean, he said this is for political reasons to make it supportable. For the economic side, I don't think it's a particularly good idea, because eliminating the tax max effectively raises the top marginal tax rate by 12 percentage points. So you're going from, say, 43% today to somewhere in the mid-50s. I just think that's too high. But raising the tax max or eliminating the payroll tax ceiling in order to increase benefits actually makes things worse off, because you're taking off the table one of the options that could have been used to make the system solvent. In other words, you can't raise or eliminate the tax max twice. So if you do that in order to raise benefits, then we have to come back and address solvency, and one of those options that was on the table is no longer on the table. And so then the folks who are sponsoring these plans have to say, okay, now that we've taken that off the table, what are we going to do to fix the system so that your sister, or by the way, me, can have benefits when we retire? And so I think you really have to think first, how do we pay for what we have promised? To promise additional benefits before you've paid for what you've already promised, it just confirms all the stereotypes people have about politicians. No offense.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Doggett, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of our witnesses for your testimony. My feeling is that Social Security is one of the most effective programs that we have ever approved in this Congress. I think one would be hard-pressed to find a family across America that has not had a family member who has obtained dignity in retirement as a result of Social Security, and if they look back in the past, who suffered greatly when Social Security was not there. Many of these families have a neighbor who is able to survive after a serious injury or disability because of Social Security disability, or a child who would never have completed high school without the survivor benefits of Social Security. Vital programs. And yes, there are improvements that need to be made. I believe you've outlined what some of them may be. I'm willing to work, as I believe my Democratic colleagues for the most part are willing to work to make constructive changes to improve Social Security and be sure that it is there not just for grandparents but for our grandchildren. There are some obstacles to doing that. And one of those obstacles is the fact that while we're told today that there's a broken piggy bank in the trust fund, there are always those who are out there who see that trust fund and the assets in it as an incredible profit center for privatizing Social Security. And right through the last round of elections, we're advocating that the only solution to this impending crisis, as it has been described, is to privatize the Social Security system and break the bond that some were opposing in 1935 and have ever since about an effective social insurance program. And then there are those who suggest that Social Security has an impending crisis and therefore the only solution is to cut everyone's benefits. If the only issues at stake are how much can we cut and how much should we turn these public assets, these benefits paid into the social insurance system to Wall Street, we will never get the changes that are necessary. I think some of them are modest, some are more controversial and politically difficult to undertake, but we'll never get the changes needed to ensure that we have longer-term solvency for Social Security. The suggestion has been made that the Social Security system is just so complex that it can't be fully understood and utilized. There are some changes that are necessary that relate to some of those complexities. I think the complexity mainly affects people at the upper end of the income scale for whom Social Security is probably not the principal source of retirement security. I think that for most Americans, like the women that Ms. Entemacher was talking about earlier, it's all pretty simple. You work hard, you pay into the Social Security system. When you retire, when you become disabled, or you lose a spouse or parent, you get Social Security benefits. And relative to the complexities, we have Social Security offices around the country, staffed with people, as my Republican colleague was just saying, who seem to be doing a pretty good job at 1,200 local offices in explaining, based on their expertise, how the Social Security system works. And we have an 800 number that people can call if they're not close by a Social Security system. That means, though, that over the past 4 years, that cuts have occurred in the Social Security budget, that we've lost about 1 in 10 of the people who answer the phones or who are available to answer the questions. And that's why the request that Mr. Becerra has made about the need for us to exercise our oversight responsibilities and look at the budget of the Social Security system is so very important. As far as the complexities of this. Ms. Entmacher, you're an expert on how our Social Security policy affects older women, nearly half of whom would live in poverty without Social Security. Is the main problem that these women are having with Social Security's complexity? Is that the real barrier that they face, that it's just too confusing and complex to make the right choices?
No, it's not. I mean, the main problem that women have with retirement security is lower wages throughout their working life, caregiving responsibilities, the high cost of child care, which often means that they can't really afford to work because the wages that they get barely pays for child care, and yet that means time out of the workforce and less opportunity to build up Social Security benefits or retirement savings. It's just many women struggle to make ends meet throughout their working life, and Social Security is what they have to count on. And that's the main problem. And unfortunately, many women work in very demanding jobs. People don't think of retail work as physically tough, but people are on their feet for many hours. People who are nurses' aides, that's an incredibly hard job, and they simply can't, even if they know that they can get more by waiting until their full retirement age to claim benefits, they just can't make it. And of course, for both older women and men who have lost jobs in the recession, it takes much longer to find another job. And so many people, if they can't get reemployed, they have to claim at 62 because they have no other income. I think those are the major challenges that many people face.
Thank you. Mr. Renesi, you're recognized.
First, I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I'm glad we are here to discuss the role Social Security plays in Americans' retirement security. I think this is a very important topic, considering the solvency of the program and the rate at which older workers are retiring. According to the trustees' report, Social Security's present value of unfunded liabilities over the next 75 years equals $10.6 trillion, which is $1 trillion more than last year. I have to be honest, I am shocked to hear my friends across the aisle when they say there is no cause for immediate action. Instead of addressing the issue, we continue to kick the can down the road for future generations. This unfortunate reality is that government officials and the American people do not have a good grasp of really our dire financial situation. Our country is more than $17 trillion in debt, and digging our way out is not as simple as cashing in on Treasury securities. If the Social Security obligations were added to our debt, our true liabilities could be well over $50 trillion. As a CPA and former businessman, I came to Washington to really bring business perspective to an institution that sorely lacks it. We cannot continue to jump from budget crisis to budget crisis, and as many of the witnesses have talked about, Mr. Kotlikoff and Mr. Biggs, we really have to start addressing some of these problems. To help us really get on the right track, I introduced the Federal Financial Statement Transparency Act, which is a bipartisan bill that will lead to more honest depiction of our nation's finances. The federal government, think about this, requires public companies to have an honest depiction of their finances to sell securities, and the federal government should be able to meet those same standards and really show what our true liabilities are. Mr. Blahas, what would the impact be on the Social Security Trust Fund if all unfunded liabilities needed to be paid out, and is there a cause for concern?
Well, there absolutely is cause for concern. And as I think a point that was made here earlier today, although we do report the 75-year, what we call the open group obligation, which is the $10.6 trillion obligation, I think sort of the actual amount of unfunded obligations within the Social Security system is actually substantially higher than that. And the reason for that is that the excess of the shortfall is not something that actually sort of plays out gradually over time. It's actually something that is on the books now. There is an excess of benefit obligations over contributions for people who are already in the system. And that's actually about $24 trillion, and that's about 4.4% of future wages going forward. And that is a number we report in the Social Security Trustees report. So if you were to take this, what some people call the closed group obligation, and add that to the books now, you would add about $24 trillion to our current liabilities.
So will Social Security taxes this year be adequate to fund benefit obligations, current benefit obligations?
They will not.
Okay, how far short will they come this year?
It's about $80 billion.
Okay, so where will that money come from to make up the difference?
Well, when the payroll taxes fall short of benefit obligations, the difference has to be made with payments from the general fund. Right now, they'd be in the form of interest payments from the general fund to the trust fund, and a large share of those interest payments would go out the door immediately to pay beneficiaries.
So you're saying that the money flows from the government's general fund to the trust fund?
Yes.
Does that portion of Social Security spending add to the federal deficit?
Yes, it does.
So $80 billion is added to the federal deficit this year?
That's right.
Why doesn't that get highlighted more in the trustees' report?
Well, there's a lot of different perspectives that the trustees' report takes, and a lot of the trustees' report is just devoted to diagnosing the actuarial status of the trust funds, irrespective of the effect on the overall federal budget. Now, there are certainly those of us who believe that we as trustees have a duty to put before lawmakers the implications of honoring Social Security obligations for the government's general fund. But that is obviously something that if there was a feeling that we need to do more of that, that's something I can take back to the other trustees.
So we have $17 trillion in debt. We have potentially 10 to 20 trillion in unfunded liabilities. We could have over 50 trillion total liabilities just in those two areas. And we have 80 billion each year, at least this year, that is going to exceed what comes in. I would somewhat believe we have a current problem that we need to fix, and it's something we can't kick down the road, as I continue to hear. This is an issue that we need to start looking into. And Mr. Kolikoff, I know you've mentioned some of those issues too.
Yeah, well, you're an accountant, so we have kindred interests here. More than 1,000 economists, including 17 Nobel Prize winners, have endorsed something called the Inform Act. If you go to the informact.org, you will see that they've endorsed bill, which is a bipartisan bill called H.R. 2967. And that bill requires infinite horizon fiscal gap accounting by the CBO, the GAO, and the OMB on an ongoing basis. And what we're seeing here is the entire economics profession, with the exception of people like Paul Krugman on one extreme and Art Laffer on another extreme, they're saying, if you look at the names of these people, they're on the right and the left. You've got people like Glenn Hubbard and Jeff Sachs agreeing to do infinite horizon fiscal gap. So the economics profession is not confused about how to do the right accounting. The trustees of the Social Security Administration are hiding the right accounting in their appendix. They've actually moved it back this year to table F61 in the appendix. It used to be not in the appendix. Now it's buried in the appendix. And that says that what's really going on is that the unfunded liability of Social Security is actually 60% larger than the 75-year number you're focused on. So this system is actually in far worse shape, and it's part of a country's fiscal policy that's in far worse shape. And yes, Mr. Becerra, it's absolutely true that when you run $1 trillion war, okay, over 10 years, and you get nothing out of it for real in terms of any real success, that adds $1 trillion. If you don't pay for it, that adds $1 trillion burden to your kids and my kids and everybody else's kids. So we have to understand that we're engaged in take-as-you-go policies, not pay-as-you-go, but take-as-you-go policies on a wide-scale basis. We've been changing the tax structure to lower taxes on asset income. That shifts, and more on wage income. That shifts taxes away from older people towards younger people. We're doing a lot of things that are burdening everybody's children. So there is the issue of generational equity. There's the issue of intragenerational equity. We have to look at both of these. And if you go to the purpleplans.org, one other website to send you to, you will see a set of plans that have been endorsed by a lot of economists that I developed. Each one's a postcard length. It does involve a reform for Social Security, for taxes, for health care, comprehensive for the financial system. This is what economists would do to get rid of our overall fiscal gap, and you guys could agree on, because it's purple, because it's including blue and red considerations here. That's why it's called purple. And many, many economists, including Nobel Prize winners, have endorsed these plans. So I encourage you, A, to to vote to pass the Inform Act. So we started doing proper fiscal accounting, comprehensive fiscal accounting, infinite horizon fiscal accounting, which is the only proper thing that economic theory says to do, and then also to adopt the purple plans, which will get rid of the fiscal
gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schwartz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With Mr. Becerra here, like, where do you start in the conversation we're having? Let me first say that I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. We have this recent report, but we know that Social Security has issues going forward. That really is not a divide between Republicans and Democrats. It really isn't. How we solve it is, which is why we keep having hearings about what the problem is rather than how we're going to solve it. That's really what we're dealing with yet again today. I can tell you the number of hearings I've been to that describe the fact that whether it's actually gone, we have longer time. We have till 2033. That's a good thing, to have time to work it out. But no one disagrees that we should tackle this issue. The issue is, how do we tackle it? And what we as Democrats believe is that Social Security has been a strength for this country to be able to say to people as they age that you will not die in poverty. And it's worked. We start there. And we start with an understanding, particularly having just gone through the recent recession, that in fact converting it to a 401k does not provide that kind of security. And that's been suggested, to privatize it, to give people the right to invest it any way they might. You go through another 2008. How many of you lost money in your 401ks? I assume every one of you have one. And you all lost money in it. Now maybe you're young enough to be able to make up for that, but if you were 70, maybe not so much. So what we need to be focusing on, and really I'm interested that none of you have, while some of you are offering solutions, none of you have talked about two very important aspects that we have to take into account here. One is the demographics of what's happening for seniors. We have a lot more of them, 10,000 more a day, 40 million more seniors. You call Social Security, they tell you that. They say there are 40 million seniors out there who are calling us right now, so you might have to wait. Now, I don't think they're all calling every minute, but sometimes many of them are, and we don't have enough people to answer the lines, but they do get back to you. And that is a huge problem for the next 20, 25 years, maybe 30 if medical science is really, really good and we diet and exercise. But it's, we're not going to live forever. This is not a problem for 75 years. It's a really important blip, which is why we have a surplus in the Social Security Trust Fund. We occasionally have to put it back in because we borrow against it, but the fact is that money is there. In the wisdom in 1983, the Congress realized that they needed to put some extra money in for all those millions of extra seniors. So the fact is that the reason we don't want to talk about it as a crisis, because of what some of you have been saying, is that we want young people and those approaching retirement to understand that Social Security will be there for them, because we are committed to making sure it is. Those benefits have been important to America. It keeps seniors out of poverty, particularly women who get lower wages and have less Social Security benefits. So, but we have work to do. So, one of the other things you have not mentioned, in addition to the issue about the demographics, is income inequality and wage inequality in this country. So you can talk about 4%, who said we have to add 4% to wages. Fact is that in the last 2-3 decades, wage disparity may be unpredicted by the great economists of this nation, but certainly it was a deliberate result of particularly tax cuts to the very wealthy and the way we treat unearned income in this nation. So we have to understand that there are lower wage, there are people earning money, but we are now taking out of Social Security. My staff tells me 82.5% of payroll is what we tax. We're not even taxing a lot of payroll. You can all nod, say yes. Is that correct? You talked about that?
Yes.
We have, that's right. So one of the ways to look at this is, are we being fair to the workers you've talked about? Not just our children and grandchildren, but right now, are we being fair to workers? If we are actually, the cap has not been growing as quickly as it might, given the way wage disparity and income disparity in this nation. So while you keep talking about cutting benefits and making Social Security a private system and other ways to do it, you've really not talked about the fact that there is a lot of wealth and a lot of income that we're not touching out there that could help solve this problem. And I would say to the chairman, I would love to see this committee actually have a hearing about how we would solve this problem. Because what we do by just talking about it as a crisis is to scare people. And when you scare people, we don't make very good decisions. So while some of you said, let's not rush into it, I think you said that, let's not do it because we're scaring people that Social Security won't be there for them. It will be there for them if we actually make a commitment as a Congress to protect Social Security benefits and the legacy and going into the future. So I guess I would, it's hard to ask a question because I'm not sure that you'll answer it the way I want you to, given the balance. But my time's expired. So let me, the question is to each and every one of you is to really work on the solutions to this, not just the crisis, and to ask the chairman to actually focus on what will work to protect and secure Social Security into the future. That's what we ought to be discussing today. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, thanks for having the hearing, and thanks to our panel for being there. I sometimes get confused. I came out of the private sector, and so when we start talking about who provides the revenue for all these programs, I think sometimes it's the government, and we all know that that is not true. These are based on wage taxes or transferred from the general fund, which are based on taxes that are levied on every single hardworking American taxpayer. So as we put this back and forth, and while we don't want to politicize it, we absolutely do. Is there anybody that would disagree with me that the only way to get this fixed is to look at where the revenue streams come from and understand that that flow has been interrupted with an economy that just hasn't recovered in a nation that has unbelievable assets. So we can go back and forth with this about Republican-Democrat problem. This is not a Republican-Democrat. This is an American problem. Am I mistaken that I've signed paychecks for a long time? 6.2% of every person I signed a paycheck for, I also matched their what I paid them. They put 6.2% in. The dealership put 6.2%. It was 12.4%. So am I misunderstanding where the revenues come from? Doctor, Mr. Schreiber, go ahead.
Well, most of the revenue does come out of payroll taxes.
Right.
Now, of course, there's interest being accrued on the trust fund balance. Certainly, a portion of the kind of immediate growth in the unfunded liabilities, the reduction in the period of benefits that are going to be paid, is related to what's happened to the economy over the last several years. But since 1994, we're actually celebrating the 20th anniversary this week, I guess, with the release of the trustees report. The trustees have been telling us that there's a big demographic problem, that the system has to be rebalanced. There's a demographic problem. So a major portion of it is the demographics.
No, I get it. It's like the navigator on the Titanic saying, listen, there's an iceberg out there. Maybe you ought to change where you're going and actually maybe scale it back a little bit. And the captain's saying, oh, the heck with that. You don't understand. Not even God could sink this boat. Now, having said that, because I'm worried about this, workforce participation is at the lowest rate it has been in 36 years. Now, I'm looking at these taxpayers the same way. There's an old adage about there was, don't worry about the mule, just load the wagon. The mule's about ready to unhitch himself and say, I can't pull this load, it's too heavy. Or that, add another mule to help me pull it. When you have that many people, when you have almost 92 million Americans opting out of the labor force, do you think over the course of time that could have effect on the revenues we need to run this country? Is there anybody that disagrees with that? Because I'm trying to figure out, we have all these willing hearts, but we have weak wallets. Where does the money come from? Is there anybody out there? Forget about the government paying for this stuff. The government doesn't pay for 1 red cent. American taxpayers do. We've gone so far away from how it works. It just drives me nuts. We sit around here almost arguing how many angels we can fit in the head of a pin. In the meanwhile, we got a program that's a great program, but it's not funded the right way. And we also, by the way, not everybody deriving a benefit has put any money in. So let's not get too out of whack on that. Yes, sir. Yeah, Mr. Kotlikoff.
Well, I think there's a resource everybody here could use, which is economists. and I know we don't have the greatest reputation in the world, but what? Yeah. But you know, if you do look at the purpleplans.org, you'll see a fix for Social Security, for the tax system. We can do things on the tax system that the Democrats would like, the Republicans would like. You know, for example, that would actually, I think, improve the progressivity of the system, but in the process shift the corporate tax from the corporations onto the households who receive the shareholders in a way that would bring more business back into the country, keep businesses from leaving, get more jobs here. We have a very difficult international competitive situation. We have a very difficult problem with smart machines taking people's jobs. But on the Social Security issue, Ms. Schwartz, the solution, there is a solution that's different from just maintaining the current system, which if I actually sat down with you for a day and went through the inequities and the mistreatment of low-income people, high-income people, middle-income people, this is like a random lottery what you get out of the system because it's so complicated. If you don't know what you're, and you can't call the Social Security system, whether they're well paid or not, whether they have more people or not, they're giving the wrong answers routinely. I know this because I have a little company that does Social Security software. I also write a column every week for PBS NewsHour about Social Security. I get people emailing me and writing me every day about the mistakes Social Security is making. These are the people that are getting to the people on the phone. It's too complicated. So one idea on the Purple Social Security plan is and this is not privatization as you know it, but it's individualization, but it's progressive. Think about freezing the old system in place, paying off everything that's accrued and by putting in zeros in the earnings record, and then going to a new system for Social Security where everybody contributes 8% of their pay to a single account. Well, they have their own name on each account, but the contributions are divided 50-50 between spouses and legal partners. The government makes matching contributions on behalf of the poor. It's all invested in one way, not by Wall Street, but by a computer, a laptop, in a global market-weighted index fund with a floor, so the government would guarantee a zero real return, so if we have a crash, but everybody gets the same rate of return, and at the end of the accumulation phase, the government would annuitize the account balances on a cohort basis. This is a way.
Gentleman's time has expired.
That's okay.
And I do want to apologize. I believe this was Mr. Kelly's time, so you may want to be answering his question. I
no,
apologize,
no.
Mr. Chairman.
No,
this was not my intention.
Trying to give you a solution.
I'd be
but
curious to know
think-
whether his plan
yeah.
actually
Yeah.
taxes people above the $170,000 cap is now in your system.
One of these plans does eliminate the ceiling on the payroll tax. If you look at the purple tax plan, so it's a set of
Well, you may want to
plans.
speak to Mr. Kelly about this. He was
But
really
no,
saying everyone is treated exactly the same,
No,
and
it's-
people are not because there's a cap on the income.
I guess what I'm trying to say really quickly
Okay, it's
is
not
that we
your
have a
time.
lot of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Uh,
Mr. Thompson.
sir.
You're recognized.
I hate to deprive you of the opportunity to mention the purple plan a couple more times. I want to just comment on a couple of things that have been said today. We're at that time of the hearing where just about everything has been said. But my friend from Pennsylvania, I don't want you to think you're the only person who's come out of the private sector. A lot of us have, and some of us are still writing checks on our private sector businesses, and we know well how things operate. Some things, while the private sector is great, and I wouldn't trade my business for anything, there's some things that need to be left to the government, and I think everybody would agree with that to some degree. And I don't know how far out that iceberg was when whatever exchange happened between the captain and the observer, and we don't have black boxes back then, so we probably will never know. But I doubt strongly if it was 19 years out.
Well,
And that is a point.
traveling
that
at a different
I think,
rate of speed than the Titanic, though.
I think that is a point that has to be reiterated because any failure to do that does put us in a position where a number of people have mentioned, it becomes an issue of frightening people. And we should be ashamed of ourselves if we're frightening senior citizens. And I don't think my district is made up of people any different than anybody else on this dais. But when the rhetoric gets ramped up, I have people come to me all the time worried about whether or not Social Security is broken, broke, bankrupt. The wheels aren't falling off of this car for a while. Now, granted, we do have problems. They need to be worked on. As Ms. Schwartz said, that's what we should be doing, is trying to figure out how to solve these problems, not trying to figure out how to whip up everybody into some fear position where it benefits somebody politically. In regard to the Social Security, every one of us in this room factors Social Security into our retirement. Every constituent we represent factors Social Security into their retirement. This is not something that we only talk about in this hearing or in political ads. And I can tell you that my constituents want a Social Security office that's open. So if they need something, they can go down there. They can sit and talk to people. Ms. Etmacher mentioned the computer stuff. You know, I have young Social Security recipients who feel better about going into the office and sitting down with a human being rather than trying to do a calculation online. And I think we do a terrible disservice when we deprive folks of that opportunity. I want to ask Mr. Blauhaus, you're talking about this shortcoming. Do you factor in the interest on the trust fund in your calculations? Because your numbers are night and day difference between the numbers that I got from our staff. And we show a $19.3 billion surplus.
Well, it depends on what.
I know it always depends on how you figure. What is it? Figures never lie, but.
Well, I was asked the question as to what was the relationship between payroll tax revenue and expenditures. So that answer, of course, excluded the interest.
So is it accurate that we have a $19.3 billion surplus, factoring in the tax revenues of $883.4 billion? Interests of $99 billion, operating expenses of $5.7 billion?
It's accurate that the trust fund had an increase in its balance. So the trust fund, the amount of trust fund assets increased. So from a trust fund perspective, we had a surplus. If you're asking me from an overall budget perspective, did we have a surplus? The answer is no, because the interest payments are from one government account to the other.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to put these accurate numbers into the record, because I think it was very misleading to go down that road. And we've got, and I'm assuming staff can put a proper draft together for you. But again, it just feeds into the idea that we're going to frighten people, and I don't think that's right. I think right would be all of us sitting down and figuring out what sort of tweaks we need to make the system work. And just by a show of hands, how many of y'all on the witness table believe we should privatize Social Security? No, I didn't ask for any commentary.
Yeah.
So nobody thinks we should privatize Social Security?
Yeah.
Well, I think we should individualize it. I'm not sure we should. I wouldn't privatize it the way President Bush proposed.
My time's expired. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
it has. Thank you, and we'll put this in the record. How about Mr. Griffin? Are you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. It was great to hear my colleagues say that they would never use Medicare or Social Security to scare people. That make sure your party leadership knows that. That'll probably be a news flash. Mr. Blauhaus, I want to ask you, from a practical standpoint, let's say we get to the point where the trust fund does not have the money to pay out. I think a lot of people, a lot of Americans sort of feel like, yeah, well, on paper that will happen at some point, but maybe my benefits will never be affected because we'll just borrow it, right? So I want you to walk me through what what the practical impact would be in terms of where the money would come from if there aren't benefit cuts. So I assume we would have to find in general revenue the money to shore up the fund, the way sort of we've done with the Highway Trust Fund. That would come out of discretionary funds, and we wouldn't have that money most likely. So that would be borrowed. Could you sort of walk through what the practical implications of that would be? Could we even borrow that much? How much money are we talking about borrowing when we get to the point where we don't have enough money to pay out, and all the bad things that we've heard, benefits be cut and all that? What would we have to do if reforms do not occur? What would we have to do to continue on the path that we're on?
Right. At the point where the combined trust funds, assuming we reallocate taxes between the trust funds and then they're depleted in 2033, one of the common methods that the trustees use to describe quantities within the Social Security system is as a percentage of the program's tax base. So for example, in 1983, when we had a shortfall to close, the long-term shortfall was described as 1.8% of the program's tax base. In order to fill that, they delayed the COLAs by 6 months, they exposed benefits to taxation for the first time, they brought in newly hired federal employees, they raised their eligibility age, et cetera. They did all these things, and that added up to about 1.8% of the tax base. And they did about half of it on each side, half of it on the revenue side, half of it on the benefit side. If we wait till 2033, our shortfall, our annual shortfall, will be about 4.2% of taxable payroll. So we would have to make changes, again, hitting the admonition, not wanting to scare people, but you have to make changes over twice as severe, about 2.5 times as severe. And the question is, would our political system, would people on the right be over twice as willing to raise taxes as they've ever been willing to do before? Would people on the left be over twice as willing to cut benefits? Both of them twice as willing.
What about people who'd say, well, we would, I'm not advocating this, but we would just borrow that money?
Well,
how much are we talking about here?
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. It's over. Again, it's in dollar figures. It's going to be much bigger because we're looking way into the future, and so that's why we tend to do it as a percentage of GDP or as a percent of taxable payroll. But you'd have to borrow, if you wanted to do it through borrowing, you'd have to borrow an amount that's equal to over 4% of what workers are earning, and that's a tremendous amount of money.
Right.
And
that's not an option, is the point. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
in terms of getting that money, borrowing that sort of money, adding that to the debt.
My personal view, and this is not necessarily a consensus view among experts, my personal view is that at that point it's a bridge too far to balance system finances, and we wouldn't be able politically to sustain the system without turning it into a program that's financed from the general fund. And then we'd lose a lot of the things that have made Social Security a stable, reliable benefit over the years.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's scary to me. I'm not a senior yet. I hope I make that, but that's scary to me in and of itself. Let me ask you real quickly, could you talk a little bit about our culture and the role that Social Security played in the early days versus now, in terms of whether people had in the early days other sources of income for retirement versus today? Has there been a movement, and I think I know the answer to this, has there been a movement over the years to rely solely on Social Security for a bigger percentage of the population, or is it the same general? I'd like to know that. I see you shaking your head.
I think the first point I'd make is that if we still had the system that was left to us by FDR, we wouldn't have a financial shortfall right now. It's the subsequent expansions that have put us in financial trouble. We added the disability component later on.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it was an appropriate thing to do. Then we added early eligibility. People are now collecting at 62 more often than any other age. Originally, they could only collect at 65. So we're collecting 3 years earlier, and we're living a lot longer. And then in the 1970s, we expanded. We added a 20% benefit increase, and we started wage indexing the benefits. And so now we have cost issues that we didn't have under the original design of Social Security. So when people talk about sort of the historic legacy of Social Security, it's not the FDR legacy that is really in jeopardy. The program he left to us is stable. It's the subsequent expansions that are causing us the trouble.
I'm out of time, Mr. Schreiber, but the chairman, in his mercy, might allow you to
Well, in
respond.
in 2008, there were $532.87 billion paid in Social Security benefits. The combined IRA and pension annuity benefits paid to Social Security beneficiaries was $568 billion. So the benefits paid out of pensions and IRAs was actually larger than Social Security benefits. Last year, we got tax data on both of them, and none of these tax qualified benefits existed, or very minuscule amounts of them existed in the 1930s. So there's a much greater dependence now on these tax qualified benefits, people's personal savings or personal pensions, than we've had in the past. Of course, we haven't been reporting it. We've only been reporting 40% of it. So we have no, in terms of what you've been told, are generally being told, you have no idea what this other part of the retirement system is really about. And it would seem to me that might be important when you think about retirement income security.
Thank you, Ms. Entmeyer. You look fidgety. Did you want to say something?
I would. Thank you very much. First of all, yes, it's not Franklin Roosevelt's retirement program, and it's a very good thing. I know that many people have pointed to what a great job Social Security has done in reducing elderly poverty since Franklin Roosevelt's days. And what may be less understood is that most of that decrease has come through the improvements that were made to Social Security that were just discussed. Particularly for women, the automatic COLA, increased benefits for widows. Those have been incredibly important and valuable. Second, what is causing the shortfall in Social Security is not rising benefits. As has been indicated, benefits are actually going down from what they would have been because of the 1983 cuts. And in 1983, people tried to, and did for a couple of years, establish solvency for 75 years. What has created much of the shortfall is the growth in inequality, the shrinking of wages for ordinary Americans, and the growth in wages at the top, which was not foreseen by people in 1983. And lastly, because trillions of dollars are really frightening, I would like to point out that the growth in Social Security's cost is about 1.2% of GDP over the next several decades, and then it levels off. 1.2% of GDP is less than what we had to come up with when the baby boomers were kids and public education was more expensive. We spend about, I have the CBO estimates of tax expenditures. The tax expenditure for giving preferential rates on capital gains is 1% of GDP per year. We can afford to cover the shortfall and make improvements in Social Security. We shouldn't wait to do it, and we don't have to do it all at one blow, but we can reassure people that Social Security will be there.
Thank you for your comments, ma'am. And without objection, I'll insert into the record my response to Mr. Becerra's letter, which was inserted into the record earlier. In closing, I want to thank all of you for your testimony and thank our members who are still here for being here. Social Security is facing the biggest challenge since 1983, and the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to fix. In the meantime, workers can't be sure how to plan for their retirement because they don't know what to expect from Social Security. We've got real work to do. Americans want, need, and deserve a Social Security program they can count on with benefit amounts they can understand. With that, the committee stands adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, I know we've just adjourned. I would like to hear you. I know some of you still wanted to respond. I would like to stay and hear. I heard what you said, ma'am. I do not agree with you. And I think there's a number of us that would not. So I'll stay and listen. I want to hear what you have to say. If this isn't a crisis, we better look up in the dictionary what a crisis is.
This is a huge crisis. This is a the country The country's broke, and Social Security is broke
Mr.
too, and
Chairman.
it's not broke in
Mr.
30
Chairman,
years.
are we still in hearing?
I
or are we,
will withdraw my adjournment.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Social Security is not broke in 30 years or in 20 years or in 10 years. It's broke today. We need, according to the trustees' report, table F61, just go look at it. It's buried, but you can find it. We need a 4.1% hike in payroll in the payroll tax rate. That's a 33% hike in the payroll tax rate for Social Security starting today, immediately and permanent. 33% tax hike. That's in the trustees' report. This is what 1,000 economists at every top school, Stanford, Harvard, MIT, Chicago, you name it, Princeton, 17 Nobel Prize winners, and they're not Republicans, they're not Democrats, they're both, okay? That's what they're saying to look at, guys. You guys keep talking about the 75-year numbers. Economics doesn't support that. It says you have to look at the infinite horizon. Now, this does not mean that the system is system is broke.
Mr. Chairman, I
It's
think
entirely
we
broke.
have to, if we want to have more discussion, I think that's fine. I think it's always important, as I think members have pointed out. We want to get to the solutions and rather than just talking about the issues. And so I think we can do that, but I think we have to do it in a way that's organized and constructive. If we're going to have every witness comment, we can do that, but that's going to take more time. Mr. Chairman, so long as we can just establish how you want to do this, you want to give them a chance to
Well, what I would prefer to do is let you all submit something for the record. If you care to, we will put it in. And with that, I think the committee stands adjourned. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, fine, good, okay.